All right, we're back. This is the Dinesh D'Souza podcast. I'm Brandon Gill filling in for Dinesh this week. Last week, Mike Pence made a surprise trip to the Ukraine. He met with the country's frontman, Volodymyr Zelensky, and actually happened to be in Kiev at the same time as Greta Thunberg. We don't know if they met each other, but it must have felt like a gathering of world visionaries. Alongside Nikki Haley, Mike Pence has been one of the more outspoken supporters of the Ukraine war amongst Republican primary candidates. According to NBC, Pence, quote, Pence, the first candidate in the crowded Republican 2024 presidential field to visit Ukraine, countered directly the rising America First wing of modern conservatism and sought to position himself as the party's leading champion of the hawkish foreign policy that defined the party for decades. And when he was there, he said the trip, quote, just steels my resolve to do my part to continue to call for strong American support for our Ukraine friends and allies. And that apparent friendship was reciprocal. One of Zelensky's top advisors praised Mike Pence, saying, quote, he deeply understands Russia and deeply understands the nature of this conflict. That it's not about the territories, not about any businesses, not about anything except the main thing, those values for which the United States were created. What are those values? Well, they're, quote, freedom, competition, and democracy. Of course, there was little questioning how Ukraine, the country that just canceled its presidential elections, is now the shining city on a hill for democracy, but that's another issue. Mike Pence isn't the only Republican candidate beating the war drums for Ukrainian democracy. Nikki Haley criticized Joe Biden last week for being, quote, far too slow and weak in helping Ukraine. It's a conflict she has described as not about Ukraine, it's about freedom. We've heard almost identical rhetoric from Tim Scott and Chris Christie, two other presidential contenders, as well as from Republican senators and intellectual leaders. And it's not just Republicans. At a time when we are told bipartisanship is dead, when neither side can even agree on which bathroom to use, elites in both parties have virtually indistinguishable views on the war. According to Chuck Schumer, we have a moral obligation to stand with our friends in Ukraine. The fight they are in is a struggle between democracy and authoritarianism itself. And we dare not relent or delay swift action to help our friends in need. As Nancy Pelosi told Zelensky over video, quote, your fight is a fight for everyone. And earlier this year, Joe Biden flew to Kiev to tell Ukraine, you remind us that freedom is priceless. It's worth fighting for as long as it takes. And that's how long we're going to be with you, for as long as it takes. So there's a consensus amongst the ruling class that the war in Ukraine is America's war too. It's a moral crusade, and like it or not, we are one of its captains. Now, obviously, it's not a war Congress formally declared. No American voted to join Ukraine's fight against Russia. In fact, there's been almost no substantive debate about it amongst our ruling class at all. It's extremely popular. It's moral. Remember, it's for freedom and democracy, so why question it? But there are some questions worth asking. For example, is another country's freedom and democracy really a reason to go to war? Most countries around the world aren't free, and few have well-functioning democracies. Do we? But we aren't invading the Democratic Republic of the Congo or Iran or Uzbekistan, but none of them are free or democratic. One of the major problems with going to war based solely on abstract moral principles is that we don't ask other important questions either. Like, is this even in the national interest? Would winning this war benefit us? And if so, how much? And what is the cost we're willing to pay for victory? How much can we pay? How much are we willing to risk? How do we balance the benefits of possible victory against the economic, social, and political costs? Not to mention the cost in lives. And what happens if we lose? What are the risks? What are the chances of winning? What if this war turns into something much bigger than it is now? Or even, are there alternatives to war? Is there a path for possible peace? These aren't always pleasant questions to ask. They don't make you feel warm and fuzzy inside when blind moral charges do. But the foundation of sound strategic geopolitical analysis is a recognition that we have limited resources, that we have to make trade-offs between competing interests, and that we have to weigh the costs, benefits, and risks of any potential course of action. Geopolitics are like a chessboard, and you don't blindly send your queen out on moral crusades, because if you do, you risk losing your king. We have to ask questions first. The real problem here isn't that we don't have good answers to these questions. It's that nobody in the political elite is even asking them. And they haven't been for decades, at least until 2015, when Donald Trump on a Republican primary debate stage asked why we spent $4 trillion in the Iraq War when we could have spent it at home. What was the purpose? It's worth hearing his answer because in some of the questions he asked, because the situation in Ukraine is similar. Trump said, quote, "We've spent $4 trillion trying to topple various people that, frankly, if they were there, and if we could have spent $4 trillion in the United States to fix our roads, our bridges, and all of the other problems, our airports and all the other problems we have, we would have been a lot better off. I can tell you that right now." End quote. Trump asked the questions nobody, especially no Republicans, were supposed to ask, but he did, and he's doing the exact same thing with Ukraine. Last week, President Trump gave an interview with Reuters, and he said, quote, "I want people to stop dying over this ridiculous war." He then went on, "I think the biggest thing that the U.S. should be doing right now is making peace. Getting Russia and Ukraine together and making peace. You can do it." And while the rest of the political class spent last week cheering on the attempted coup in Russia, Trump seemed to be one of the few voices of actual reason and prudence. In the same interview, he stated that if Putin were no longer in power, you don't know what the alternative is. It could be better, but it could be far worse. What he's saying used to be the basis of sound, rational foreign policy, but Trump is one of the only people today saying this. But the deeper point isn't to say that Trump is right about Ukraine, even though he absolutely is. Rather, it's to say that Trump's conception of foreign policy is correct on a far deeper, more fundamental level. It's conservative at its core. And in international relations parlance, it's realist. It's based on truth and concrete reality, not opaque notions of freedom and democracy. And today it's far too rare, and Trump's voice is a voice we desperately need.